Hi, I'm Cece with A21 Freedom Chasers, and today's segment is with Kirsta, Melton, and Mallory, Vincent. They are the founders of the Institute to Combat Trafficking, and I'd like for them to introduce themselves for just a second and spend some time telling us a little bit about who they are and what they do.
Well, good morning. My name is Kirsta Melton. I am a prosecutor by trade. I've been a prosecutor for about 20-something years, first in Bexar County, Texas, in San Antonio for 15, and then at the Attorney General's office for an additional 15, running the Human Trafficking and Transnational Organized Crime section there. I'm now the CEO of the Institute to Combat Trafficking, which is an on-location strike team that goes to folks to help them with investigation, training and prosecution of human trafficking cases around the state of Texas and around the country. We also work on community-specific assessments and solutions to human trafficking, specifically targeting prevention and early interdiction. And then finally, we're concerned with the policy piece and really making sure the policy is grounded in reality.
And my name is Mallory Vincent. I am originally from the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and I spent some time prosecuting in San Antonio, where I went to law school, before I spent the last almost 5 years at the Texas Attorney General's office in Austin, working in the human trafficking section that Kirsta was the chief of. And then most recently, I'm a part of the Institute to Combat Trafficking, and I serve as the chief operating officer.
How cool. Yeah, thank you all for joining me. I know that you must be really busy. So tell us a little bit about the Institute to Combat Trafficking. I know this is a new organization. I was excited when I read a little bit about it. What led you to start the organization?
The reason we started the organization is that because in our experience, what we've seen is there are major gaps in the system where human trafficking victims and their cases tend to fall and never come out of. So one, you often have the fact that victims do not self-identify, and therefore cases never get to an initial outcry at all. But even beyond that, you have victims who do outcry. Maybe they outcry to an outreach worker or a victim services provider. Maybe they even outcry to law enforcement. But oftentimes, that initial outcry does not go forward in the way that it should in terms of a solid investigation and preparation of a case. And so that's one of the major gaps we see. The secondary gap that we'll see is maybe a case, there is an initial outcry. Maybe that victim will speak to someone at a victim serving organization, but they aren't comfortable talking to law enforcement. So again, the case dies. And what happens is you have victims that are removed from their trafficker, but the trafficker is not removed from the system. And so they simply go right back to pulling additional victims from the community and continuing on in their business. So ICT is really dedicated to closing those gaps. We have worked within this system for a very long time with regulatory agencies, with law enforcement, and with prosecution. And our goal is to help these agencies get cases from the moment they are identified all the way through to a successful criminal prosecution. So one, we stop the perpetuation of victimization. And two, we are able to successfully provide accountability for human traffickers. Because in the end, our view is this: that justice is as fundamental a need for victims as is housing, as is job security, as is any of those core things that we think about as needs. Justice is one of those things that will haunt them throughout their lives, or injustice will, if no one in the system forces accountability on their behalf.
Yeah, that's so important. I love how you worded all of that. So you mentioned in your introduction that you are working internationally with this, right? Or is it just in the US, a national thing?
It's within the US, that's okay. Correct.
Wonderful. I've seen a lot of like stories lately about, different operations here and there during this time, during COVID time going on with finding missing children and whatnot. Is any of that correlated to any of the work that you all have done or have plugged into and have received any kind of, leads to or things like that here in Texas?
No, we're not working with any of those specific operations at this time. Where we come in is where we would have a law enforcement agency or regulatory agency call and say, hey, we have a case, or we have the beginnings of a case, and now we'd like to make sure that that case is going to be worked in a sustainable way so that it results in a prosecution that can actually go forward and bring accountability for that trafficker. So we kind of come in, we can work at that early stage in terms of developing operations, but primarily we're working when folks encounter one of these cases. One, are they identifying them as a trafficking case? Two, do they know how to approach and deal with those victims in a way that will actually produce justice on behalf of that victim? And then three, are they able, when those cases run into brick walls, which they will most assuredly do in the course of time, are they able to, instead of just losing the case at that point, right, find a way around that wall, over that wall, or through that wall, so that we reach a successful, essentially a prosecution in the end.
Right, right. Yeah, no, that's awesome. Mallory, do you have any insight for us on this work?
I mean, I think for us, what we saw over and over again, and what we continue to see over and over again in these cases, is law enforcement they want to work the case, they want to see justice served, they want to see it come to fruition, but these cases, as we all know, are just different. They require different types of corroborating evidence. They require different types of, honestly, interviewing, because oftentimes when you're interviewing a human trafficking victim, it looks very different than when you're interviewing a typical, what we would call a typical sexual assault victim, or a different type of victim in another kind of crime. And so we have to kind of help them shift that framework and work with them on that. And so for us, this really missing piece, missing gap that we identified in the system, I think that's what ICT can really come in and fill that space. And we just want to walk alongside prosecutors, we want to walk alongside investigators, and we want to help them work through these cases to ultimately see justice served.
Right. Yeah, no, that's awesome. I remember reading a story about a particular case that wasn't here in Texas, it was in California, but it was kind of similar to what you're talking about, in the sense that the prosecution was struggling with coming up with a defense for their victim, and essentially took them a while to think really creatively, and then were able to successfully help the victim get victory in this case. But it was like, I never would have thought that, you know, you'd have to fight so hard to get these cases through. But when you think about, right, creatively, they're creative too, and the other side wants to win as well, right? So you have to be really good about what you know and how to present it well. And gosh, I admire y'all for what you do. Is there anything that you could tell people? I know, especially during this time with COVID, we all are online and we're all home, and we read some of these stories about trafficking and whatnot, and people tend to get really frustrated or annoyed at the fact that this even exists. What kind of message could you tell us about why it's important to keep fighting this fight, but to stay encouraged and to know that we're making strides on every aspect, from awareness to prosecution? What can you tell people about staying encouraged against this fight against human trafficking as a whole?
I think the biggest thing is that when you look at a crime that's as devastating as human trafficking, and you look at the fact that it literally has been going on since the beginning of time, a lot of times that's overwhelming to people. And they say, well, there's nothing I can do about that, right? It's too big for me. It's gone on too long. The consequences are too painful for those who have to go through them. So I'm going to leave that to the professionals. One, I think it's important for them to know there are professionals that are working, as you said, Cece, on every aspect of the human trafficking issue, whether that's from policy, whether that's direct victim services, whether that's advocacy, whether that's prevention, early interdiction, or whether that is bringing accountability and stopping the traffickers in their tracks. One, that is happening. So when you hear these stories, I think sometimes on social media, you think, oh my gosh, social media has discovered human trafficking. When in reality, human trafficking has been around and people have been working on this issue. Federally, there's been a law involved for 20 plus years within the state of Texas. There's been a law for 17, right, since 2003. So there have been efforts being made. Now, the second thing for you to remember is there's more room for work to be done. And the third is that each of us has an obligation when it comes to this, because the bottom line is this: human trafficking attacks our basic humanity, which means it impacts not only the victims, but it impacts each of us, right? Because if we stop valuing people as people, that is something that permeates our entire lives. If people become simply a goods, right? Something to be traded, something to be bought and sold, we are all devalued from that. So our role as citizens is, one, to understand what human trafficking is and what it isn't. It is to be aware that there are red flags that we can look for in people within our community. And that may be in your online community right now. But we need to be paying attention to other people as people, right? Because then when we see those red flags, we can follow up with additional questions. We can try to get more information, and then we can pass that information on to the National Human Trafficking Hotline, to Child Protective Services, to law enforcement. We can begin that process of involving professionals to work on this case and to work on that particular individual circumstances. So it's not hopeless. And each thing that you do makes a difference. And I will tell you that in both Mallory and my experience, most of our cases, right, have come from someone else, someone outside the trafficking victim, who has seen a situation, who has identified it as a problem, and who's been willing to take a step, whether that's to make a call, whether that's to intervene in that particular moment. They are the reason that traffickers end up in prison. It is regular people that are doing that work day in and day out. And so it can't be done without you, right? You have to be a part of that. And so that gives us a certain sense of power, because it gives us the ability to make a difference in what would otherwise be an overwhelming problem. I think God calls us to grow where we're planted, right? He doesn't call each of us to the other one's occupation or the other one's space. We're called to grow where we're planted. And that is probably one of the most hopeful things that we can all think about when we're dealing with any sort of large global problem, is I'm responsible for where I am and doing with what I have, what I can to help someone to the best of my ability.
Yeah. Sorry, Valerie, do you have something to add to that?
No, I mean, I would just say, you know, the number one question we always get asked is like, well, what if I do something and then I'm not sure, or it might be, but I don't want to get anybody in trouble, or I don't want to do something. And I would just say, echo what Kirsta said, is make that call, right? I don't have children myself, but I do have nieces and nephews, and I know that if they were even in the threat of harm, I'd rather somebody call and it be nothing, right, than somebody to leave them there for one more minute or one more day to be brutalized. And so I would encourage people to learn the red flags, learn what to be looking for. And if you see something, do something about it, right? Call law enforcement, call the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And this isn't just going to be something where you're like, maybe, maybe not, right? This is when that pit in your stomach, the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, and you're like, I need to do something. I think I need to call somebody. So that would be my encouragement, because we have seen it over and over again from just everyday people driving down the road, from people that were a gym manager at a local gym, things like that. I mean, people really have the ability to make a difference.
Yeah, absolutely. I love how you mentioned, you know, that we are to grow where we're planted, right? And that's anywhere we're at, whether it's our occupation or, you know, any volunteer opportunities we have at our children's schools, or just anywhere. And I think that one of the biggest things I tell people is, once you become aware of what human trafficking looks like, share that with your friends, right? Keep the message going. And I'm sure that you all feel the same way, but once you mention or educate someone on what human trafficking is, then they'll come back and say, you know, now I see this topic all the time.
Absolutely.
And they hear stories, or they see it on the news, and they're more aware and more keen. I know in my conversations with law enforcement here locally, they have also said the same thing. We would rather get 100 phone calls that are false than to miss the one opportunity to help one person. How can people get a hold of you or do some more research on getting information about whether or not your organization can help them through the process of prosecution and things like that?
Well, we have a website. It's justicestartsnow.org, and you can go to our website. It has a direct email for Kirsta and I. But it also has, we have a whole resources page. We spent a lot of time in developing our website that we wanted it to be practical. Yes, we want you to be able to reach out to the Institute to Combat Trafficking. We want you to reach out for our services. But if you're coming to learn, we want to help and walk alongside you in that. And so we have red flags that are industry specific. There's both sex and labor. We also have a link to multiple articles, multiple research if you're really wanting to do that deeper dive into human trafficking and some of the psychology behind it. And then we have links to some videos, right? Videos that we've either been a part of or have seen and know that they have value and can teach. And so that's all on our website. You can also find more about kind of the different things we do, both helping law enforcement and prosecution. We also have a program called Cities for Justice that's designed to go into cities, whether that's a smaller city or a mid-sized city, and come in and really educate that city on human trafficking. Because what we've seen in our time in this work is that sometimes you get those teachers really fired up and they're ready to go and they start reporting to law enforcement. But if law enforcement doesn't know what they're calling about, right, then that case dies before it ever gets started. And so Cities for Justice is designed to go in and to have everyone speaking the same language, to teach CPS, right, to walk through that with them locally, to walk through it with teachers, doctors, nurses, law enforcement, professionals, you know, everybody down to the general public, right, to be everybody on the same line. So you can learn more about all of that on our website. So we would encourage you to go there, to reach out if you're interested, or if you just need some additional resources.
Awesome. Thank you. I'll make sure that we link your website and the resources page. Any last thoughts for anything going on in your world? One fun question that I'm asking everyone is, what's one blessing that has come out of this pandemic for you personally?
I'd say it has been, and I'm sure lots of people have said this. It's been, for me, I did a ton of traveling in my work at the Attorney General's office. So I have been able to be home with my kids who are a junior in high school and a freshman in college. And while that has its own, rub to it, it has been a real privilege to be at home and to walk with them through that. And even the things that drive me crazy, like, making sure we've got food on the table and all those things, that's still, I've gotten to be the mom, right, a little bit more in a present way. And I think that's been a huge blessing for me, and again, a learning experience as we kind of learn to kind of all work together in 4 different Zoom worlds and all the other things that we've got going on.
I have a lot going on in my household. I think for me, the biggest blessing has been, the time to just kind of sit and think, and as a believer, just to pray. And my husband travels a lot for work, and we were based in Austin, but now with ICT, we are home-based and we travel all across the state and we can travel all across the country. And so my husband and I decided to move closer to family, which moving during the pandemic, I do not recommend. But in the end, I think it's a huge blessing for our family. And so I think the pandemic kind of forced us to go, okay, what are we doing? What's really important to us at the end of the day? So I think in the end, it's a huge blessing.
Yeah, definitely. It kind of came so suddenly, but then we learned to embrace it quickly, right? And pivot and make new normals, I guess.
I think the only thing is this, Cece, is we want people to know that we are there to help. So law enforcement, are you working a case? Do you need help? That's what we're there for. That's a matter of making that call to us so that we can come alongside you and help get you through the rocky parts of that case, or get you through that initial interview, or help you figure out where to go when that case hits that brick wall. And that's true for regulatory agencies, that's true for prosecutors, and that's true for communities. Are you a community that's fired up about this issue? Well, then Cities for Justice is for you. Mm-hmm. And we'd love to see you call us and say, I want Cities of Justice in our community, mm-hmm. and talk about what that's going to take for us to get that there. So that's the biggest thing, is that that justice piece, I think we forget a lot of times how important that is. And we also forget how time sensitive it is, because a lot of times trafficking victims delay in speaking out, which is very, very normal. But then once they do, right, that evidence is only there for so long. And you want to seize upon that as quickly as you can to bring those cases to a successful conclusion. I mean, it doesn't matter what type of victim of crime you are. The last thing you want as you are starting a new life and beginning to become a survivor and learn what it's like to live in that completely different world. You don't want to look back over your shoulder and wonder if your trafficker is going to call you or show up on your doorstep or bomb your social media or just appear back in your life. And it happens. We're there to make sure it doesn't happen.
Yeah.
That's our job.
Yeah. Are there any, I guess, gaps? I'm sure there are, right? Lots of gaps in our legislative portion of this whole, trying to fight human trafficking. And how do we rally around that you've seen? Like, what are some things that we can do as an awareness group around those pieces?
I think it'll be interesting to see which pieces are coming up this year. In the past, for instance, last year, there were a couple of pieces of the Human Trafficking Task Force legislation that did not make it through, that were changes to the evidentiary code that would have been extremely helpful for prosecutors trying these cases if those had gone through. So I'd love to see those be brought back again. I think always victim services has a strong need for more practical monetary support. I think there is a need for more comprehensive information sharing within agencies, believe it or not, even within, for instance, just the state. There is a need to share information within state agencies, and then think about within each county, and then sharing between the county and the state levels, and then outside of government, right? Can we access that healthcare information that we need, or those SANE exams? How does victim services play into that? I think one of the most frustrating things, if I were a victim of trafficking, would be having to go from place to place to place to look for the services that I need, and having to reiterate every time what I'm having to do, and to do it in a different way, right? And my information doesn't go with me, and it doesn't follow me in any way, shape, or way. And so I have to start over. And I think that's one of the super frustrating things for law enforcement, is when victim services gets an outcry, they get detailed information, and yet that never makes it over to law enforcement. And then something bad happens down the road, and you're like, well, why wasn't there a prosecution? Well, there wasn't an investigation. So there wasn't a prosecution because they never got that key information that they needed. Those are the things that are so, I think, frustrating to us looking at the system, but it's also got to be incredibly frustrating for victims. And I think part of why they give up, right? I don't care about the system. I'm just going to go on and do what I'm going to do. I'm going to take what I can get, right, in terms of help, but I'm not going to trust that a system that has betrayed me multiple times over the course of time is now going to show up and do for me in a really useful way. And so I think we've got to change that social compact that we have. And when we say we're going to do something, we're going to follow through. There's follow through, and there's a net that's catching those cases that are falling through the gap. Can every case be tried successfully? No, they can't. There's going to be cases that are going to be dismissed because they simply can't be proven, right? Or a jury may find a defendant not guilty. But the last thing we want is for those cases never to move through the system because of our failings, right? Because we within the system somehow can't make those connections between one another that are so critical and so important. And I think bridging that gap between the service side and the law enforcement side, between the regulatory agency and getting something investigated, between, all of those things and prosecution, that's critically important. And then taking what we know from the practice and using that to change the law, so that the law isn't being made up because it sounds like a good idea, but the law is being generated from what we see in practice. That's the key, right? That's when you have good law. If it's based on the reality of what your law enforcement and prosecution and what your victims are actually facing in the process. Without that reality, it's a bunch of words on a paper, and sometimes it can be far more harmful than good, despite the intent of those who are seeking to do their best in terms of the generation of that work.
Right. Yeah, that makes total sense. I love the partnership that you all create with different organizations just to be able to come in side by side and help them through all of it. Is there a particular place in that whole process that would be best to engage y'all, or is it just anywhere in the process of investigation to prosecution to all of it? Is there a particular place where we could plug y'all in if we knew of something that was needed for a victim and getting them help?
I would say anywhere in that process, right? I mean, we are not direct victim services in that sense that we're not providing housing or things like that. But what we are doing is, yeah, if you have somebody, for instance, who is a victim and wants to speak and wants to start moving a case forward, yeah, you can call us there, right? If you're an agency that investigates illicit massage, and you're running into those things and you want to actually see, is there a trafficking case there, or is this straight prostitution, or what is this? You can call us there. If you're in the midst of an investigation and you're running into problems, you can call us there. If that case has already gone to the prosecution level, but it's one where you're like, oh, now we don't have the victim. Is there another way to get around that? Can we try this case in a different way? You can call us there. Like, we can walk through any of those spaces and try to help problem solve. Can we solve every problem? Absolutely not. But we can bring you additional resources, and we can bring you experience, and we can bring you just the benefit of having tried really problematic cases over the years, and yet still trying them through, like still getting them done, and still seeking justice for those victims. One of the things you said earlier, Cece, was kind of speaking out and speaking for others. I think that's what the heart of a prosecutor is, right? We speak for those who cannot speak for themselves. We represent the state in standing up for what is right for that victim and for our community. And we draw a line and we say, no, you've crossed that line, and now there is a severe consequence for crossing that line, and we're going to force you back beyond it. And so many of our victims, I don't think, recognize that they are worth that fight.
Right.
They matter. Not just what happens to somebody else, they matter. And we want to seek accountability on their behalf.
I'll never forget the story you told us at our walk 5 years ago about the one case that you handled. Can you tell us quickly what the whole case was about, and then at the end what the judge said?
Oh, absolutely. And it was the jury. It was the jury that
okay.
That particular case. Yeah, that was a young lady. She was, this was the very first trafficking trial in San Antonio, and involved a 13-year-old child. She was the second of 4 kids. Her parents were divorced. She lived primarily with mom, but she saw her dad on and off. Her dad had been kind of in and out of trouble with the law over the course of time, but he still loved his daughter and still was a part of her life. Sometimes this kid went to school. Sometimes she did not go to school. And on this particular day, she didn't go to school. She walked down to the corner store in her neighborhood in San Antonio, and she picked up a lady that she knew there, and the couple of them walked another few blocks to a house where you could purchase drugs. And this house was owned by 2 brothers. They were members of the Orojons, and these guys basically sold drugs. They grew some in their backyard, others they got from dealers, and they would sell there in the neighborhood. And excuse me, they went in. This kid purchased some pot. She was smoking her pot. She needed to go to the bathroom. She asked to be taken to the bathroom. Now, this house didn't really have running water or electricity, but it had, technically a bathroom, and they took her up there and they locked her behind a door. and they sent the lady that she was with away. And the lady went back to the corner store and looked for the kid, because that's where they told her that she was. She came back, she asked for her again, and little did she know that this kid was behind that door. So about an hour to an hour and a half later, they opened the door, they grabbed her bodily, they drug her across the hallway to a room where they had a bed. And they tied her to that bed with the yellow nylon ropes that people use to tie things to their cars. And then they both raped her. And then they decided that they would keep her and they would sell her to anyone who had extra money after they bought drugs. And so for the next week and a half to 2 weeks, 20 buyers, some of them repeat buyers, came and paid $25 a piece to rape a 13-year-old child, drugged up, tied up, and laying in her own urine and feces. And that is literally how the city of San Antonio learned about the crime of human trafficking. So she was rescued by a man from the neighborhood. And that's what I'm talking about. These individuals who see that something is wrong. Guarantee you'd never heard the word human trafficking in his life. He knew this kid from the corner store. And when he was offered to this opportunity, instead of taking it, he ran her out of that location to a place of safety. Now, she didn't go immediately home. It was a couple weeks later, she ended up being picked up by juvenile because she obviously had not been to school. She also had she was on probation for juvenile at that time. And it was a juvenile probation officer who just sat down with her and said, what happened? Where you been? What's going on? And it was to that person that she shared her story. And he took that information down. He tried at that time to get law enforcement to engage with her. But like many of our trafficking victims, she had a juvenile history. She had lied. She had caused problems in the jail before, right? She didn't have a good reputation. And this didn't look like a little kid who had been molested, right? Didn't fit this pattern. But eventually the Bexar County Sheriff's Office worked on this case, brought it to our office. It was the first trafficking case that we had seen. There was one other in the pipeline that came around the same time. Eventually we were able to take that case to trial. And that was a trial based largely on this child's testimony. And yet a jury here in San Antonio, they heard her, they heard all the ugly detail, they heard all the complications of her life, they heard the things that she had messed up on. And in the end, they still believed her. And they found the first brother guilty in 2010, second brother guilty in 2012. But that very first trial, they found the first brother guilty. They went back, they heard punishment evidence, and then they came back and they gave life sentences across the board for human trafficking, compelling prostitution, aggravated sexual assault, and aggravated kidnapping. And we get to go back if the jury wants to talk to us, prosecutors and defense attorneys, after a trial is over, and we can answer questions, or we can just have conversation with them, learn what we can, right, to help us do better the next time we present a case. So they talked to us for a very long time. And at the end of that time, we were getting ready to go, they were getting ready to go. And they just said to us, will you see her? And I said, oh yeah, we're gonna see her, right? We've got the second brother to try. We have 2 buyers that we've been able to identify. We're gonna have a long periods of time with this kid. And they said, well, we have a message for her. You tell her that we gave life because she was worth it. We gave life because she was worth it. And when I speak about human trafficking, there's no case that so eloquently speaks to the core issue. And that is that people have value. No matter who they are, no matter where they've come from, no matter what they've done or what's been done to them, people have value. And when we start to live with that as our underlying fundamental principle, we will see the world begin to change around.
Yeah, that's so powerful. And, you know, if you're watching this segment and you have experienced some kind of trafficking, if some of the things that we've mentioned are triggering you, we'd love to partner with you and let you know that this same message is also for you. Your life has value, and we would love to wrap arms with you and help you in any case we can. Feel free to reach out to us. Feel free to reach out to Kirsta and her team. We would love to connect with you and help you walk through this together. Ladies, thank you so much for joining us. I'm so excited just to hear more about what your organization is going to be a part of in the future. I know that things are different right now, but thank you for working through all of this. And yeah, and I'm excited to see how we can incorporate some work in the future, but thank you again for joining me.